In September of 1973, Ada Mercer came in from checking the south fence and found her husband's wedding ring on the kitchen table. Not a note, not an apology. Just a gold band beside the sugar bowl, 2 empty drawers upstairs, and a clean rectangle in the dust where his radio used to sit. Elliot had taken the sedan, his pressed shirts, his savings account book, and every ounce of belief he had ever pretended to have in the Mercer farm. By sundown, he would be on his way to St. Louis, where a friend had promised him a desk at a savings and loan office. He called it a future. He called the farm a grave with grass on top. Before he left, he had stood in that kitchen in his polished shoes and looked at Ada's mud-caked boots like they were evidence against her. "You are 26 years old," he said. "You cannot run 760 acres by stubbornness. Sell before the bank does it for you." Then he was gone. What Elliot did not know was that the real inheritance on that farm was not the land, the cattle, or even the house. It was hidden in an old feed chest under a cracked horse blanket. 9 oilcloth notebooks, 43 years of rain, grass, birth weights, calf losses, creek behavior, grazing rotations, bad winters, good bulls, weak mothers, strong bloodlines, and every mistake Ada's father had paid for once, so she would not have to pay for it twice. Those notebooks would make the neighbors call her desperate. They would make a banker call her a bad risk. And 20 years later, they would make the man who abandoned her come back down the same gravel road and ask if she had any work. The Mercer place sat in the Missouri Ozark foothills, where the ridges looked soft from a distance and punished fools up close. 760 acres of limestone shelves, fescue, clover, creek bottoms, black walnut shade, and slopes that could turn a tractor sideways if a driver forgot the ground had opinions. Ada had grown up there. She knew where spring water showed itself after 3 dry weeks. She knew which gate sagged when the frost came out of the ground. She knew the old bull would not cross a narrow shadow unless someone led him with a bucket. But knowing a place as a daughter was not the same as owning it alone. Her father, Thomas Mercer, had died 18 months earlier after a lung illness that drained the family like a slow leak in a cistern. The hospital bills had become bank notes. The bank notes had become monthly envelopes. The envelopes had become a second weather system hanging over the farm. Elliot had never loved the place. He had tolerated it while Thomas was alive, because Thomas filled a room without raising his voice. But once the old man was gone, Elliot saw only debt, mud, aging equipment, and neighbors who talked more with their hands than with their mouths. At the feed store, the advice came wrapped in pity. "You need scale," the men told her. "Borrow for a bigger tractor. Add cows. Put up more hay. Modern farming is numbers." They said it gently, which made it worse. They looked past Ada when they talked, as if a husband, brother, or uncle might step forward from behind a rack of mineral blocks and answer for her. They remembered Thomas Mercer as a broad-shouldered cattleman who could pull a calf in a storm and quote rainfall totals from 1952. They looked at Ada and saw a young wife left behind in a pair of patched overalls. A farm in slow motion. That was the story they were ready to believe. Then Ada opened the feed chest. She found the notebooks because she was looking for a wrench. a corner of oilcloth caught on a nail, and under the horse blanket lay the whole secret history of her father's mind. The first pages were simple records: calving dates, weaning weights, sires, pasture numbers, sales, illness, cull decisions. Then the pages deepened. Thomas had drawn creek maps with arrows, showing where floodwater cut first and where it lied before it rose. He had marked the ridges that held grass in drought. He had tracked which cow families raised heavy calves without grain, and which pretty cows ate like queens and paid like thieves. He wrote down frost dates, moonless nights, fence breaks, hoof rot, clover stands, hay waste, wind direction during ice storms, and the behavior of every spring on the place. In one margin, beside a note about a cow that looked impressive and raised a weak calf 3 years running, he wrote, "The market admires size. The farm pays for appetite." In another, after a year when half the county borrowed money for new machinery, he wrote, "A loan is not a tool unless it leaves before dark. Keep it overnight, and it starts acting like an owner." Ada sat on the feed room floor until the light went flat. The notebooks were not nostalgia. They were not a dead man's hobby. They were a working system, built from the exact ground under her boots. Her first decision made everyone certain she was failing. On the western edge of the farm lay 62 acres locals called the Cedar Sink. It looked useful on a plat map and miserable in person. Thin grass, shallow soil, a soggy low pocket that ate fence posts and grew nothing but broom sedge and mosquitoes. Thomas had studied it for years and finally written one plain sentence: "This ground costs more attention than it returns." Elliot had always wanted to keep it because more acres sounded stronger in a bank lobby. Ada read the notebooks differently. The Cedar Sink was not pride. It was dead weight with taxes attached. Her neighbor, Darrell Ketchum, had wanted that strip for years because it squared off his property line and gave him road access to a bottom field. Darrell believed in the new farming gospel with the confidence of a man who had never met a loan officer he did not like. Bigger fields, bigger machines, bigger herd, bigger future. So when Ada offered him the Cedar Sink, he smirked just enough to show what he thought was happening. He thought the abandoned wife was selling the farm by the mouthful. Ada let him think it. She negotiated cash, not promises. No trade, no note, no delayed payment. Cash at closing. 2 days later, she walked into the Bank of Hart County, endorsed the cashier's check, and paid off the hospital note tied to her father's final year. The clerk blinked. Ada asked for a receipt showing a zero balance. Then she folded it into the front page of the first notebook, exactly where her father had written about loans, acting like owners. By Friday, the story at the feed store was that Ada Mercer had started cutting up the place. They were half right. She had cut out the infection. The next 3 years did not feel heroic. They felt like cold mornings, broken knuckles, and going to bed too tired to be scared. Ada sold every cow that needed a sack of feed to look good. That included some of the largest animals on the place, the kind buyers admired in a lot because they filled the eye. She kept the hard-working mothers that stayed slick on grass, calved clean, and got bred back without drama. Her herd shrank from 181 cows to 129. The neighbors saw retreat. Ada saw concentration. She divided big pastures into smaller grazing paddocks with wire she stretched herself. She seeded clover into tired fields. She left creek banks rested longer than men at the co-op thought reasonable. She changed the calving window because the notebooks showed that late winter calves cost more in feed and sickness than the heavier sale weights justified. Every adjustment had a reason, not a feeling, not pride. A reason. There were nights when reason did not feel like enough. In January of 1976, sleet sealed the gates and froze the water troughs with a skin of gray glass. Near midnight, a first calf heifer went down in the lower barn with a calf turned wrong. Ada worked by lantern light while the wind shoved snow through the wall cracks. Her arms shook from cold. The heifer bawled until the rafters seemed to answer. Twice Ada lost her grip. Once she sat back in the straw and said out loud to nobody, "I can't." The word sounded like Elliot. That made her angry enough to stand. She ran to the tack room, opened the fourth notebook with hands so stiff she could barely turn the pages, and found a note from February 1958. Backward calf. Do not pull against her. Find the hocks. Fold the legs. Work when she works. Rest when she rests. Ada went back into the barn. She stopped fighting the animal and started listening to her. By dawn, a wet black bull calf was breathing in the straw. The heifer was licking him clean, and Ada was leaning against a post, covered to the elbows, crying without making a sound. That was the night the farm stopped feeling like something she had been left to defend. It became something that was answering her. Then came the spring flood. The rain began on a Thursday afternoon in April and did not behave like rain. It behaved like a thing with a grudge. It hammered the tin roof, filled the ruts, jumped the ditches, and turned Brush Creek from a clear ribbon into a brown animal chewing its own banks. By the second night, neighbors were driving trucks through water with flashlights swinging from their windows, trying to guess which low pastures would go next. Ada did not guess. Camas had drawn that flood before she was born. In the seventh notebook, under the heading 1947 Water, he had mapped the order of drowning. South Bottom first, East Hay Flat next, Low Lane by the sycamores by midnight, Safe Ground, Limestone Knob, North Ridge, Old Orchard Slope. Ada saddled a mare named Cricket and rode into rain hard enough to sting her face. She opened gates in the dark. She pushed cattle through sucking mud. She lost her hat. She tore her sleeve on barbed wire. Twice lightning showed her the herd like a painting, red and black bodies moving uphill through sheets of water. By 3 in the morning, every cow she owned was on the limestone knob. At sunrise, Brush Creek was no longer a creek. It was a wide brown sheet crossing the farm where fences used to be. The bottom fences were gone. The feed shed had shifted on its blocks. The old machine barn leaned like a drunk. But the cattle were alive. Every single one. Darrell Ketchum lost 37 head in his rented bottomland, including the low acres he had bragged about making productive. Other men lost calves, hay, equipment, and confidence. Ada lost fences, lumber, and sleep. Not the herd. The flood gave her proof, but proof did not rebuild a barn. For the first time since paying off the hospital note, Ada needed the bank. She hated the feeling so much she wore her best dress like armor. The loan officer assigned to her was Marjorie Vale, transferred from Columbia, neat as a paper cut and twice as sharp. She read Ada's file with a slow frown. Land sold, herd reduced, one woman on the deed, recent storm damage, limited equipment debt, which the bank somehow treated not as discipline, but as insufficient ambition. "Mrs. Mercer," Marjorie said, "the bank has to consider whether this operation has adequate management capacity." Ada understood the phrase. It meant no man. Marjorie kept going. "Mr. Ketchum has expressed interest in acquiring your remaining acreage. In your position, liquidation may protect more value than continued exposure." Ada did not argue. She opened the 7th notebook to the flood map. Then she opened her own ledger. She showed Marjorie the herd count before the flood and after the flood. No losses. She showed calving survival over 3 years, 97.6%. She showed purchased feed down by more than half. She showed veterinary costs so low the banker asked if the figures were annual or quarterly. She showed the cedar sink sale, the cleared hospital note, the tax savings, the fence bids, and the repayment schedule for a repair loan small enough to be paid from the next 2 calf crops. At last, Ada laid her hand flat on the ledger. "This farm is not undermanaged," she said. "It is under-leveraged, and that is why it is still standing." Marjorie Vale looked at the young woman across the desk, as if seeing her for the first time. The loan was approved. Not warmly, not easily, but it was approved. And Ada paid it off in 19 months. The late 70s turned into the early 80s, and the world that had mocked her for avoiding debt began to break under the weight of it. Interest rates climbed like a fever. 19%, 20, 21. Land values buckled. Commodity prices fell. The men who had borrowed against every acre to buy bigger tractors and more ground found themselves farming for the bank before they farmed for their families. Auction notices appeared on telephone poles and courthouse boards. A man could spend 40 years building a name and lose it in one Saturday afternoon under an auctioneer's chant. Ada went to some of those auctions because not going felt disrespectful. She stood at the edge of crowds while machinery sold for less than the notes against it. She watched women hold their purses with both hands. She watched men stare at the dirt as if the dirt might apologize. Darrell Ketchum was among the first to fall. The flood had wounded him. Interest finished him. The cedar sink he had bought from Ada did not save him, and neither did the new equipment, the larger herd, or the language of expansion that had once sounded so intelligent at the feed store. When his tractors sold, Ada felt no triumph. A ruined neighbor was still a neighbor. But she also understood the lesson. The farm crisis did not punish only bad farmers. It punished farmers who had mistaken borrowed size for strength. Ada's farm was smaller than it had been on paper. It was stronger in every way that mattered. Her cows raised calves on grass and mineral. Her pastures held through dry spells because she never grazed them down to desperation. Her equipment was old, repaired, and paid for. Her books showed profit where others showed volume. And because she was not trapped selling only into a weak commodity market, she began selling breeding stock to the few cattlemen still thinking clearly. Grass-efficient heifers, easy calving bulls, animals that could survive without a feed bill big enough to make a banker smile. The same men who once told her to borrow now asked what clover mix she used. Some asked quietly, as if wisdom were a thing best requested out of sight. Ada answered them. She had no interest in revenge. Revenge was just another debt, and she did not keep debt around. In 1985, the Bank of Hart County called her. A foreclosed 120-acre tract touched her north boundary. It had a year-round spring, a worn hay meadow, and a lane that connected cleanly to her ridge pasture. The bank wanted it off their books before winter. Marjorie Vale, no longer crisp with superiority, named a price that would have made Darrell Ketchum sick. Ada bought it with cash. She used the spring to water the north rotation. She restored the meadow. She added cattle only after the grass could carry them. The expansion nobody had believed she could make happened without a single new note. By the early 90s, the Mercer farm looked almost unfair. The fences stood straight. The creek banks were thick with roots. The barn roof shone red after a summer repainting. The herd moved through green paddocks in a quiet rhythm that looked effortless only to people who did not understand work. Ada was in her mid-40s by then. Her hair had begun to silver at the temples. Her hands had permanent scars. Her ledgers were as disciplined as her father's, though her handwriting was smaller and faster. County extension agents came out to ask about her grazing system. Young farmers came to walk the pastures. Even Marjorie Vale sent clients to her when they wanted to understand why some operations survived and others did not. Ada never called it a secret. The notebooks were not magic. They were attention, recorded long enough to become foresight. Then, on an October afternoon in 1997, a car stopped at the end of her gravel drive. It was not the confident sedan Elliot had driven away in. This one coughed when the engine shut off. The rear fender was dented. The paint had faded in the sun. A man stepped out in a gray suit that did not fit him anymore. For a moment, Ada saw only a stranger. Then he turned, and the years arranged themselves into the face of her husband. Elliot was thinner. His hair had gone soft and pale at the edges. His shoes were polished but worn through at one heel. He looked at the house, the barns, the cattle on the ridge, and the long, straight fences, and something in his expression collapsed. He had come from St. Louis with a story the newspapers had been printing for years. Bad loans, bad bets, a failed savings and loan, pension gone, job gone, apartment gone, friends suddenly hard to reach. The world of clean hands had turned out to have dirt under its nails after all. He did not say he was wrong, not at first. Men like Elliot often needed hunger to translate pride into language. He asked if he could stay for a little while. He said he was willing to work. He said he knew the place, at least some of it. He looked past Ada toward the kitchen window like memory might open the door for him. Ada listened. She remembered the ring by the sugar bowl. She remembered the word, sell. She remembered nights when her shoulders burned from lifting what he had left behind. But the anger that had once lived close to the surface was gone. The land had taught her that storms pass, weeds return, and not every broken rail deserves the same piece of timber. There is work, she said. Relief came over Elliot's face so quickly, it almost made him young. The north fence needs walking twice a week. The lower barn needs scraping before winter. There is a room in the old hired man's cabin. Supper is at 6, if the day's work is done. He swallowed. Thank you, Ada. I don't know what to. She raised one hand. You will answer to Leo Barnes. He runs the cattle crew. He will tell you what needs doing, and he will sign your hours. Elliot stared at her. Ada's voice did not rise. You left this farm because you thought it was beneath you. You came back because the world you trusted would not hold you. I will not shame you for needing work. Work is honorable. She looked past him toward the ridge, where the herd moved through late sunlight, exactly where her father had once written they should. But understand this before you unpack. You are not returning as my husband. You are not returning as an owner. You are not returning as the man who knows better. The wind moved through the dry leaves beside the drive. This farm has books now. Mine, my father's, the bank's receipts, the breeding records, the weather maps. They all say the same thing. She stepped down from the porch. I run the place. Elliot lowered his eyes to the gravel. 24 years earlier, he had left a ring on a table because he thought Ada Mercer was standing at the end of a dying way of life. But she had not been standing at an ending. She had been standing at the door of a system he was too proud to read. He chased the future into offices that collapsed under their own cleverness. She stayed with a land people called old-fashioned, and learned its language well enough to build something no bank could own. The farm remembered drought. It remembered flood. It remembered every hoof, every note, every foolish assumption dragged across its fields. And Ada remembered too. Around Hart County, people eventually stopped saying Thomas Mercer had left his daughter a farm. That was too small a sentence. He had left her away to listen. And she had listened so closely that when the whole modern world came asking for proof, the ground itself had already answered.